Thank you for joining us for ELA's Ecological Webinar Series. I'm Donald Pell, and we're going to be speaking about rewilding the landscape, a garden designer's approach. I've been working in the business for 26 years professionally, and before that time, I got to start working out of my family's nursery in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And often what I'm thinking about is learning from nature and trying to understand what nature would do and what we might find beautiful in nature, what experiences in nature might resonate with us. And we're often trying to recreate that in a novel plant community or in an impressionistic manner, not in a truly recreation of nature. This is the landscape that I know from my youth. This is Valley Forge National Historic Park. And when I look at this, I really start to question, what am I seeing and how might I recreate this in a fashion that's really desirable? And when I'm looking at here, I'm seeing an array of color, even in this autumn landscape, the andropogon and the purple top, and of course the elms in the background and the white oak. And understanding how nature really does not have void space for an extended period of time. That's one of the greatest lessons I think we can learn from just looking at nature. And thinking about where we might have these spontaneous plant communities. Here we can see hibiscus mostuetos and scirpus and even the Phragmites in the back and how aggressively that has colonized. And looking at the subtle changes in light and color. And again, in a winter landscape, we're seeing what looks like monocultural blocks, but when we start to really inspect further, we'll see an array of plant communities, cool season plant communities growing amongst these more emergent layers. And again, here, where if we just walk by, it just might all look like winter color, but what we really see are these tawny colors and the subtle changes of blonde and copper. And from a design point of view, I think that's very inspirational as well, and something we're always looking to understand. And even the cool season layers below, which tend to be more evergreen. Again, in this photo, we might take lessons from how plants colonize directly. We have Platanus occidentalis in the background and Alnus in the foreground. And then we're seeing Artemisia vulgaris, which clearly isn't a desirable plant, but that texture is very legible. And in terms of recreating that in a desirable fashion, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from even looking at plant communities that we don't find desirable and saying, is that color beautiful? How might I recreate that in a desirable fashion with the plant we find desirable? And then even seeing what naturalized means. Often, when I was young, I built a lot for different landscape architects in the southeast Pennsylvania, and we'd find these symmetrically placed tree plantings where everything was on these perfect 25-foot centers. And this is just adjacent to my home, a photo I took, and we have the black walnuts and black cherries growing out of one another. And I find this to be very sculptural in beauty, even amongst the suburban lawn. And I wonder, why aren't we planting now in this context where trees can be colonizing together. I find that to be very beautiful. And again, if we're trying to recreate some of these lessons of nature, we can see that trees can grow to old age right adjacent to one another, even growing out of one another. There's famous coastal redwood trees, I believe it's in Muir Woods, and they're named, and there are 4 trees almost growing right out of one another, and they're beloved enough to have been coined or named, and I think we can certainly take lessons from that. And in our own residential work, we tend to do this type of planting every once in a while, and I find it very beautiful. And even looking at what nature really wants, and how often do we go into landscapes and see a trunk growing straight out of a mulch bed. And here we're clearly seeing the buttressing roots of trees. And if we go into spontaneous woodlands, we'll see that all the time. And that's where the trees want to be. In our own practice, if we look at the old standards, they will typically tell you to plant 2 inches above the root ball. But then what we find often is our own gardeners, upon inspection, from very reputable nurseries, and I don't think it's necessarily the fault always of the nursery, other than the price points that's demanded in our industry, and the state of production that they're forced to undertake. But it's really critical that we train gardeners and owners to really understand where the root flares should be, and we can go in and inspect those trees and correct them at times of planting. And you can see here that plant, the root ball was initially about 8 to 10 inches over where that root flare actually should have been. And this is a tree that came out of a very well-respected nursery, and this is still often what we find. And again, just walking through our eastern deciduous forest, we might see this spring ephemeral layer, and it's very simple. Here we have acres and acres of mertensia, followed by ostrich fern, and it's a very simple and lush planting. And in our own design work, often we're really looking to keep planting simple and just understand first, what does this cultural landscape support, and not trying to re-engineer for a plant that we want because of our own interest, but really saying, again, we start with what the ecology will support, and really plan for more of that in the landscape. Here we have something right behind my own studio, and here is sensitive fern and Typhia latifolia and Salix nigra. And this, to me, could be a very designed landscape. I find it extremely beautiful, and it's just in amongst a thicket of multiflora rows, and you go in, and this is what you see, and I find this highly desirable. And again, a very simple composition of plants. A woody plant, you see off to the left, some black walnut, and just these other 2 herbaceous plants. And by late summer, we see jewelweed emerge out of these, the sensitive fern. And again, that's as beautiful as anything I've ever designed. And yet a very simple colonization of plants, a simple composition. Here along a highway I travel every day, or a major route among French Creek, this is a Chorus americanus and Hibiscus mostuetos. And again, if you've grown Hibiscus mostuetos in your own garden, you realize how late that plant is to emerge, and how often, if you just plant it by itself, you will experience a lot of cool season weeds colonize through that area. And often the response from owners is to want to put down mulch, not really the cultural conditions that this plant wants. especially if we're using a wood mulch for years. If you really inspect down in that hibiscus, what you see is an array of different cool season plants that stabilize the ground plane early into the season and then allow this hibiscus to emerge later in the year. So again, we're looking and we're trying to understand, and sometimes we're even moving into those spaces and really digging around a bit and trying to understand what is actually happening in these landscapes. And that's where we can glean some of the best information to recreate these landscapes in a more sustainable fashion. And again, if you look at the herbaceous layer, it looks like we're here looking at two plants. But when you really get down into the ground plane and look at the plant communities, it can be very complex. This is a historic cemetery outside of Valley Forge Park, and beautiful layering of Andropogon virginicus and Irrigrostis spectabilis. The Irrigrostis is a plant we've really come to love and rely heavily on, and often used to cover the ground plane under some of these other emergent layers. Very effective, very showy plant. And then even looking at just a spontaneous landscape like this, and I'll call it spontaneous because it was just a disturbed site for a new home we were working on, and looking at this vegetation that's just started coming in, and you can see some ryegrasses in here and looks like Japanese stilt grass. But what I really took from this is the scale of what that plant might look like set in what that home rather might look like set in among a prairie, and not just have these conventional suburban plantings. We'll call it the parsley around the turkey up around the home, but to really try to recreate this big landscape and a piece of architecture emerging out of it and not dominating the landscape. And even looking at, these weeds, I think was very informative in terms of the scale of planting I might try to forward as an idea to the owners. And then some of the other places we travel to really understand where there are extreme pressures, degraded soils, are some of these post-industrial sites. This is part of the Reading Viaduct in Philadelphia. I was here with my late colleague Paul Van Meter and the author and scientist Emma Maris and nurseryman Dale Hendricks, and looking at what would grow in these extreme sites. Here we have Cercidophilium, Katsura, and our native Eupatorium altissima, and Japanese Paulownia. In the background, you see some black cherry growing. Here we found seeded in southern magnolia growing right out of railroad ballast. And again, what we always see is the plants low on the successional chain. Again, Andropogon virginicus, and an annual that this is James Brown from the New Moon Nursery. He identified as called Bobo stylus. I've not seen that in production yet, but it was a very fine, beautiful plant. And often we give annuals a bad name, but ecology uses annuals all of the time. Chamacrista is a native partridge pea that we often use to help establish gardens until the herbaceous perennial layers can push that plant out and will reemerge if there's disturbance in the landscape. Anothera speciosa is one we don't see very long-lived, but can weave through some of the other perennial layers until that's kind of pushed out. And my firm and my own work, we're just scratching the surface with annuals, but I think they're very relevant, especially when you look at disturbed landscapes and how a landscape would heal itself. It provides a lot of information as to how we might establish a garden in a very sustainable way. Again, something that we could seed in and would rapidly colonize and stabilize a landscape until the more dominant, long-lived perennials could take their place. Here we see dogbane and coreopsis, again, growing out of that same post-industrial site, the Reading Viaduct. And the very next day, I was on a barrier island in New Jersey, and kind of difficult to see amongst the Pinus rigida, but the whole middle of that screen, all Coreopsis grandiflora. If we try to use that plant in our clay soils in gardens, often that will fail in mesic soils. But if we move to well-drained rocky sites, that plant tends to seed around happily and can be very long-lived. And then, again, the New Jersey Pinelands. This is a different landscape than I'm typically working in, but a landscape I love and I love to spend time in. These are actually just dead white cedars in amongst scirpus, but very sculptural aesthetic and a very simple ground plane. And again, it tends to be fairly difficult for us as plant enthusiasts to dial back some of these plantings, but even these grand drifts of a plant that will happily colonize a landscape when there's already so much turf grass we're trying to eradicate from some of these sites, these can be very impactful and desirable for owners, and I find them very beautiful as well, and very serene. So we're always, again, looking and trying to understand what is beautiful, and to each individual person, what do they find beautiful. But healthy is what we always find beautiful. More of the white cedars growing out of Vaccinium corymbosum, a plant that typically we're using in agriculture or permaculturists really love to have in their landscape. But even if we're just trying to build something that's aesthetically pleasing, that is a plant with beautiful flowers and beautiful berries. Of course, they're delicious, the Highbush Blueberry. And look at the autumn color here, a spectacular plant to colonize. And instead of having one, maybe 60 in a landscape, even if we could start those very affordably out of small containers or buy live sod and install that in a landscape, another very affordable way to establish these larger landscapes. This is a very desirable plant community. And looking at how do we stabilize slopes, oftentimes we're cutting the slopes back along creeks or waterways, and we're rockering them, and we're trying to get a lot of vegetation to grow. But here we can see the American beech, really able to just stabilize a lot of real estate along a bank. And although we often can't get herbaceous plants to really colonize aggressively under a mature plant like that, we often don't have a lot of weed pressure as well, because the roots on a tree like this can really outcompete almost everything on the ground plane under it. And here we see a little bit of Carex. I think this was Pensylvanica growing in this woodland, but a very effective way to stabilize landscapes is with trees. And I've been to sites where Platanix occidentalis can really hold an otherwise completely eroded slope out just with its root system. This is a granite rock face in Radnor, Pennsylvania, right off of a parking lot, and almost no soil on that. And I was just taken by how thick the vegetation was here. And often we can get very young plants with almost no soil or seeded plants to really colonize in the crevices of places. If you try to move large plant material into those areas, especially with a lot of potting soil, they really struggle to root out of that soil medium in these extreme environments. Here, the Rus diffina, maybe not as desirable as something like Rus diffina dissecta, but again, that plant in and of itself is very effective at holding space, holding slopes together. And we also see plants like penstemon growing in the crevices as well and sitting around. And that is a plant that can take some extreme conditioning, as well as the red maples and pin oaks up above that are just growing out of cracks in the soil, along with sassafras. And again, it's not necessarily always the plant we need to focus on as much as the cultural condition of the planting, and making sure we're maybe starting with young plants or trying to seed plants into those environments. And we have done that often with herbaceous and woody plants that will seed aggressively into environments, even using gravel as a mulch for young trees to seed into, or heavy wood chips. And we've had a lot of effectiveness of just seeding into these 6 inches of wood chips for woody trees and having them emerge with almost no water needs, as opposed to some of these restoration plantings we see where we're plugging in hundreds of trees only to go back a year later and see 80, 90% failures often in those type of restoration projects. Here we're basically looking at milkweed and Canada thistle. And of course, we're not recommending planting things like Canada thistle or Phragmites, but to look at the bands of color in the landscape, I think can be very inspirational in amongst these otherwise grasslands that we find often in the Mid-Atlantic. And that might be a way to recreate some of that look. This is a brand new garden planted up in Lehigh County, where it's essentially rock, and we can fill holes with soil and with water in this landscape. And no matter how much water we push into this landscape, the holes are completely dry within an hour. So a very xeric, arid landscape. But we can still recreate some of that color moving through the landscape, even in these soils. And this is a photo, again, I just was taken by what I saw on the side of the road coming through the Pinelands one day. And this was summer, and I was really taken by what last year's color looked like in the landscape. And again, the andropogon coming through panicums and irrigrostis on the side of the road. And how often have we thought about not cutting last year's vegetation back? I think most of us think fall or winter or early spring, cutting that vegetation back. But often in a garden situation, the earlier we cut back some of that warm season plant material, the longer we expose the soil to potential weed seed germination. The longer we can keep this material up in the landscape, the more shading that there'll be. Or we mow the garden and just leave that tissue on the ground, and that becomes the mulch. But here, I think that andropogon is really beautiful and completely acceptable to leave that in the garden as part of the aesthetic through the next year. We've left some grasses in our own gardens up the entire year, and just allowing the new foliage to reemerge through last year's dead foliage. And in some situations, I think that can be very beautiful and very effective as well. And again, looking at these simple landscapes, Pinelands, this is a plant I find very underused, Chasmanthium laxicum, very fine, growing in a boggy coastal plain, and very dense even in the winter. It has blonde foliage, much like Chasmanthium latifolium. And again, a plant that's not really widely used. I don't see this often in nurseries, but really a really beautiful plant. And again, here, Irrigrostis cervula, growing all through the Pinelands. I was obsessed with this plant for 2 years until I came to find what it was. It's a drop seed, and I was really interested in starting to grow this, so we grew a lot from seed, thinking it was a native plant, only to find it was something that NJ Dot was seeding for their highways restoration projects. It's from Africa and fairly aggressive. So not a plant we're excited to use yet, as we don't understand it, but I find it very beautiful, and we could recreate that look of just simple herbaceous sedges or grasses on the ground plane. And that was kind of a little bit of this, Carex divulsa, around a new, very contemporary home. Not trying to do too much with forbs, just trying to keep the ground plane very simple with a few emergent layers. And again, there's the lesson maybe we can take from just a spontaneous landscape we can find in nature. And I thought this photo was very interesting because after we put this planting together and stepped back, I realized, and I'll show you with the cursor, I thought this was ridiculous how small this planting was. I would have really much rather seen this come in and been maybe a 20 feet or so deeper. You know, the home really looks like it's set in a landscape. That is that quintessential parsley around the turkey I mentioned earlier that I'm not all that fond of. But again, lessons we learn. And here, again, the same kind of planting, Spiralis heterolepsis at Chanticleer. And you can see how beautiful and simple that is and was when they first planted it. They've since added some layers to it. I believe there's some Baptisia in there and some beautiful layers. But I find this really beautiful. Although I haven't seen Irrigrostis in nature, or I'm sorry, Spiralis in nature do this yet, and just saw some of these plantings for the first time in Illinois, part of old remnant prairies, where we only saw groupings of about a dozen or so where we found them. I think these mass colonies of Spiralis are very beautiful. Oops. Going back to things like panicum and understanding what we might face in horticulture. This is Roy Diblick's selection, Panicum brigatum Northwind, which is a really beautiful fastigiate plant. It tends to stay upright all through the winter into the following year. And the problem we see with some of these selections, and again, I want to stress that these are not hybrids. These are just selections that were pulled out of natural seeding and selected for their specific genetics. This one happened to be steel blue and upright and hold that form. One of the downsides I've seen with this plant is how aggressively this native plant does seed out into the landscape. And you can see the form on the left side of the screen is very open and billowy, not what was initially intended in this planting composition. And so if we decide to work with selections for a specific look, we'll need to understand how to edit the landscape and what to look for so we can maintain an aesthetic we're trying to achieve. And so owners don't get frustrated with plantings where they might feel the need to have a more refined look in their garden when we start having some of these plants seed in that are a little more wild in nature. Some of our clients might not be as comfortable with that, so working with gardeners to train them insofar as what they might be looking at to edit so we can maintain this aesthetic becomes very relevant. And again, a very old-fashioned plant used by Wolfgang Irma at Chicago Botanic Garden. This is Hosta Halcyon, not beloved by many in the native plants movement, but I'll tell you that the flowers on this plant are used by honeybees, although it's not a native plant. I find this to be very beautiful in mass like this, instead of maybe the 3 or 4 variegated hosta we might have around an old foundation. Almost any plant in mass, I think, can be very desirable. And moreover, if we can get a plant to colonize in a way that really suppresses any kind of weed seed or any need for mulching year after year, it might not be kind of the ultimate idealized ecological solution to some, but I think this is very effective at moving ecology forward to reduce some of the ways we're managing landscapes at this point. And then looking for new plants that we might not be all that familiar with in the trade or aren't really available in the trade. This is Sambucus abilis, still not widely available in the trade. This plant can grow to about 6 feet in full sun, and will also colonize right under American beech trees, which is in the middle there, to about 2 feet. So again, if we're trying to manage some of these public spaces, I'm not really sure about the berries on this. I imagine they are consumed by our birds, as most of the Sambucus, the elderberry, are. But this one, again, not widely available to the trade. This is the Townsend, Maryland courthouse, kind of a passion project of Wolfgang Irma's, and I spent a lot of time as a young person looking at his gardens. And if you're not familiar with his work, he was a world-renowned plantsman and was always curious about plants and how they could work and what they could bring to our habitat. And that's certainly something I share an interest in. And even some of these plants, Ligularia dentata, kind of, again, an old-fashioned plant used in mass, I think can be very beautiful. And we see this plant seed freely in landscapes. Also interesting to select out some traits you might be interested in and propagate those vegetatively if you'd like. But really beautiful foliage on this plant. The flower, I could even live without. I like the foliage so much. But I have this in my personal rear garden, and it's outcompeted Japanese stilt grass very effectively. And so again, if we're dealing with these cosmopolitan pressures, cosmopolitan weed populations, these can be very effective plants to look for instead of weeding all the time and using herbicides and using mulches, just to really start to think about the plant as the biological control. And instead of spending more money on mulches and more money on weeding, just put resources into more plants that are going to be effective in any given landscape and let them be the control for that landscape. And then in terms of other lessons we might consider that we might find desirable and healthy, this is Aronia arbutifolia and the eastern bluebird that I waited for to take this picture because they had come the year previous. And this is right outside my office window where I purposefully put these plants because I knew the bluebirds love to come in a certain time of the year, and you can see snow on these stems. And within a week, they come in when these plants get to a certain ripeness and devour them. And it was such an exciting moment to see them back last winter. And I think, we can have woody plants in windows and herbaceous plants in windows, and we could edit them out a bit so they're not devouring our home. But they do bring the landscape to our lives, especially for older or folks who might not be able to access the outdoors as easily. Why not bring the landscape to people's lives any way we can? And I think this is really exciting for me, being able to work in a garden where all my windows have gardens around them. And then we have the added benefit of bringing the birds right to our windows, which is really exciting. And then again, I'm always thinking about what's exciting. This is my daughter when she was very young, and I don't grow a specific vegetable garden and herbaceous and woody plants delineated from one another. in my garden, I have asparagus growing right out of tall emergent grass borders, and raspberry growing amongst the millennias, and blueberry bushes, and the fruit trees coming right out of native and cosmopolitan herbaceous plants. Everything's intermingled. And to be able to have these experiences and to have children be excited, they are, to me, our future gardeners and our future ecologists, and they will decide if they have these experiences now, what's important to them in the future. And again, to me, that is so relevant and something I get excited to when we build every garden, to try to have children engage with the landscape. In my own garden, I never have restricted my children from running through my planting borders. I want them to have a great experience there. And those kids were able to give garden tours to architects and tell them all of the things they could eat in my garden. And that was really a desirable experience and continues to be for me. And I love the fascination and curiosity of these spaces, and that's something I always want to really replicate. This is our studio where we used Miscanthus Giganteus, and I thought about this right off the bat. It was intentionally planted because we didn't have many resources at the time in planting this garden, and so I needed something I could grow affordably. And I also thought how interesting it would be for children to meander through these emergent layers. And for those of you not familiar with Miscanthus Giganteus, I know that's another plant with a really bad reputation because of how some of the miscanthus can be very invasive. This plant has sterile seed, and so it will never seed out in nature. It's all propagated by rhizome division. So a very safe and effective plant. We leave this grass up, and last year we did not cut this to the ground, and we just let the new layers come in and reemerge through the old layers, and it stood up beautifully, less a couple of the culms or stems that we cut off the side that might have flopped a little bit. So I'll go through, we only have about 8 minutes left. I'll go through a couple quick projects that we might have worked on in terms of some of the ways we might have programmed some of our gardens. This was a home in Chester Springs, Pennsylvania, not far from me, built in the 18th century on the Eastern Shore. The owner acquired it and brought it up to Chester County, Pennsylvania. And this was the entry to the back door. We had a lot of these cosmopolitan and grafted plants, but immediately upon entering, your experience was a straight shot to the front door. We wanted this to be more about a garden and compression and immediate experience of garden. So the idea was to just simply really reach out and bring the garden right to the guest service parking, the guest parking, and really kind of start to compress the entryways to the guest entry at the back and even the front door, which really wasn't used in this home. And so really simple plantings, aster oblongifolius and sweet bay magnolia virginiana, and some sedges in this garden. We have layers of magnolia or geranium, macarizum, bevins. This was the front of the home. It had a beautiful view of a grassland, but wasn't really much of a reason to circulate over to these front doors. The clients did love the front view, and so we really kind of tried to respect that and give them a place to sit and connect with that grassland in front a little bit with plants that would be very neat and tidy. Here's Calamagrostis octiflora Carl Forrester, and the geraniums, and Agastache Blue Fortune. And you can see on the right there, in the middle of the screen, Carex pensylvonica, which we really found would heat up way too often given the aggregate under the flagstone. And that plant was getting a lot of wood sorrel infestation and some other weeds. And we just substituted that out for another native sedge, Carex cherokeenensis, and it was exponentially more effective. We took the Pennsylvanica to the woodland up above, and that colonized nicely without the weed seed pressure. So here's an example of, instead of just continuing to weed, to really try to look and understand what's happening in that landscape and make some decisions about the evolution of that garden, because of none of these spaces are or ever will be stagnant. And just by moving out one block of sedge, we really were able to effectively reduce a lot of maintenance and make the garden just look better. Under these sugar maples, which were under some distress, again, not a lot of plants that will thrive under maples, given their root masses. Epimedium Freundleiten and Geranium Macarizum Bevins did really well until maintenance was kind of let go, and then we had a drought 2 years ago. And a lot of this plant material, after several years, did decline. And in talking to the owners, we got them a more routine schedule, as they tend to travel a bit. So if there are periods of drought, gardeners are able to come in to areas like this and give a little bit of supplemental irrigation. We don't plan our gardens with irrigation systems, and so we really are looking to establish plants that are going to thrive in any given cultural condition. But this is another one of those extreme environments where the clients want the layers on the ground plane to be dense. And so every few years we do hit a situation where we want to give some supplemental irrigation. And again, there's that Carex Pennsylvanica that just was not thriving like we had hoped it would. So again, just with some simple changes, we can make that garden more effective. And the autumn landscape. And this is the rear woodland, again, in trying to reduce some of what was otherwise a really stark, barren landscape where there was a lot of maintenance needs. We just looked at really thuggish plants, most of which were native. Here we had ostrich fern on the low side of the garden where it could absorb water, and what is now Packer aurea, which aggressively colonized that site, and Styloform diffilum, wood poppy, and the mertensias. And all of those plants tend to colonize quickly, and the owner just wanted this simple lawn pathway in. It's not extremely refined in terms of edging and mulching. Clearly there needs to be some weeding in this environment, but very effective plants that can cover a lot of real estate, and that's really what we were looking for. And I'll just go through these last few slides of this site, and then we'll take some questions. This is a site in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Again, 18th century home that was completely restored with an addition. These soils, after testing, were very low CEC, very tight, high magnesium, low calcium. So we did start a program with an agronomist we tend to work closely with to open up the soils. We used a lot of humic acid, gypsum, and calcitic lime to open up the soils, and hard and soft rock phosphate. These soils were also very low in phosphorus. And the humic acid will really bind that phosphorus up so it's not leachable, readily leachable into waterways. Here we kind of had a barren landscape and a pathway about 40 feet from the front door. Our goal was to get the client close to the front door, so there's an architectural challenge of siting a new garage. You can see here where they could park right up against a house, as we were hoping to keep them into the house as long as possible. And again, using very kind of aggressive plants that will grow in extreme environments, panicum. This is Carex divulsa, introduced by John Greenlee. Nyssa sylvatica has become happier with the amending of soil. We also use some leaf compost on this site and have continued to bring in leaf compost for 4 years now, and the soils are greatly improving. Plants like allium, this is a mix of millennium and summer beauty. You can see we salvaged stone right from the site from this curbing that was hand dressed. And the front, not a lot of woody plant material, basically big drifts of herbaceous plants. Sorry, that's our timer. And we're trying to scrim the railroad tracks beyond. The owner hated seeing them, so a couple little groves of red buds, and there's panicum coming up in the background of that site. This is Millennia Hildebrandt here in the middle of the screen, and the allium summer beauty. Baptisias and Carex muscingomensis. There's Dahlia purpurea, which we just saw out in some remnant prairies, my first tour out there. And we're really kind of immersing the living spaces in garden, and I find that really desirable personally. These owners, I think, are very happy with this program as well. And then we have some cosmopolitan plants like Begonia grandis mixed in as well. Agastache, that's Blue Fortune. Here's our native Vernonia lettermani, iron butterfly in the foreground. Perovskias and Calamagrostis. Scutellaria and Canna off to the left here, a really effective plant at seeding out. Although it's a native perennial, it can be pretty aggressive in soils at times, which I love. I'd rather edit out plants than fill in weed gardens. And plants like Heuchera, Velosa, Autumn Bride, and Carex elata. Up top we see some silphiums. So just some pretty blocky drifts in this garden, but they tend to be pretty effective. This is actually part garden, part rain garden, and we're really, when I plan rain gardens, I try to hide them in the overall garden, not make it seem like kind of a sore thumb of herbaceous plants in the middle of a property. This is Carex cherokeenensis and Millennia, transparent with panicums. And I think we're going to end there.